For today's lecture, I'm going to introduce the first couple of rules in 7.1, namely modus ponens and modus tollens. At this point, these names will sound rather foreign to you, but with a little bit of practice, it'll come together for you without any real difficulties whatsoever. 7.1 really lays the foundation for the rest of chapter number 7. So in that sense, it's really quite crucial that you do get this information down and are comfortable with it. With a little bit of practice, again, it shouldn't be any difficulty whatsoever. So I'm going to proceed in a slightly different fashion as compared to the text. The text just simply gives you the visual explanation of each of the rules of inference here in 7.1, and that will be the case for the rest of chapter 7. However, in addition to just simply giving you the visual explanation, I will also give you what I view to be much more important, namely the verbal explanation. And the reasoning behind that is rather simple. The visual explanation of the rule given to you given the text is just simply one particular case or instance of that rule, whereas the verbal explanation covers all possible cases or all possible instances of that particular rule. So with that said, let's get to our first rule, which again is called modus ponens, but we'll just simply abbreviate it for obvious reasons as MP. So here's the visual explanation, which again is quite lacking, but will give you a sense of what modus ponens is about. One generic visual explanation is as follows. On some line, we'll say premise number 1, we need something like A horseshoe B. On some other line, we'll say premise 2, we need A, and what modus ponens allows us to get out is B. So that's the straightforward visual explanation. The book tends to use lowercase p's and q's, whereas I use capital A's and B's. But keep in mind here that these are just simply variables. They're just placeholders standing in place of propositions. So that's the visual explanation. But what's really going on here? To get an understanding of what really is going on in modus ponens, you need to understand the verbal explanation, which again will cover all possible cases of modus ponens. So the verbal explanation of modus ponens, again just abbreviated MP, is as follows. In order to do modus ponens, two conditions need to be met. The two conditions are, on some line, any line will do, we'll say it's premise 1, but on some line we need a statement where the main logical operator is in fact the horseshoe. And again, it has to be the main logical operator. Just because the statement or proposition has a horseshoe in it, doesn't mean that the horseshoe is the main logical operator. To do modus ponens, the main operator does in fact have to be the horseshoe. The other condition that needs to be met is that on some other line, any line will do, we'll say line number 2, on some other line we need an antecedent, whatever it should be, but the antecedent to that horseshoe statement. And what we're allowed to get out, according to modus ponens, if these two conditions have been met, we have a horseshoe statement, and we also have, by itself, the antecedent to that horseshoe statement. Modus ponens allows us to get out for a new line the consequent of that horseshoe statement. In this case, in our first example, that would be B, but the consequent, whatever it should be. So that's the verbal explanation, much more important, because again, it's all-encompassing. It describes all possible cases of modus ponens, as opposed to the visual explanation, which is just one particular case, one particular instance of modus ponens. So horseshoe statement, where the horseshoe is the main logical operator, the antecedent by itself, and what we're allowed to get out is the consequent. And that's precisely what we have in our generic visual explanation. Line 1 is our horseshoe statement, and the only operator there is the horseshoe, so obviously, no real question, it is the main logical operator. On line number 2, we've got the antecedent to that horseshoe statement, in this case A, by itself, and what we're allowed to get out is B, the consequent of our original horseshoe statement. So let's go through a couple of more complex cases of modus ponens, and here refer to the text as well, specifically refer to these shaded little boxes. There's a shaded box for each of our first 4 rules of inference here in 7.1, and they give you some more complex cases, but you'll notice in all of these, the same basic pattern is met. Horseshoe statement, antecedent, get out the consequent. So here's a slightly more complex case of modus ponens, just to drive the point home. Suppose line 1 looks as follows. Suppose it involves a little bit more operators, a little bit more complex therefore. Suppose that we have something like this. A and D in parentheses, horseshoe, C or B in parentheses, and there our first condition is met. Many operators here, but the main logical operator obviously is the horseshoe. So the first condition is met. On some other line, we'll say line number 2, we've got A and D by itself. Now condition number 2 has been met. We've got the antecedent of our horseshoe statement on a line by itself. So the necessary conditions are in fact met. We've got the makings of modus ponens. If we need to, if this would be beneficial, we can now get out the consequent by itself, everything to the right of that horseshoe. In this case, what we're allowed to get out is C wedge B, but again, notice that that is the consequent to our horseshoe statement. So there's a slightly more complex case of modus ponens in action. A couple of additional points to get down before we move on to our next rule, modus tollens. This will be true of all of the 4 rules here in 7.1. But additional point number 1, there's no magical order here to the lines. Just as long as those 2 conditions are met, we've got a horseshoe, we've got an antecedent, we can get out the consequent. They need, however, not come in that order. For instance, to use the same example, we might have on line number 1A, on line number 2, we've got our horseshoe statement, but nonetheless, even though they're out of order according to our visual explanation, makes no difference whatsoever. Both conditions are met, horseshoe statement check, antecedent check. We are allowed to get out the consequent, which in this case is B. Again, long story short here, the ordering of the lines doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And further, this will be the last point for modus ponens, the 2 lines, the 2 conditions, need not come right next to one another. They could be separated by any number of lines. For instance, on line number 1, we might have a horseshoe statement, again, let's say A horseshoe B, and somewhere down the road in the argument, say line number 42, and don't worry too terribly much here, we won't see anything nearly that long, even when we really get into the heart of chapter number 7. But nonetheless, let's suppose that we've got a horseshoe statement, and somewhere else in the argument, we've got the antecedent by itself, which in this case again would be A. We still have the makings of modus ponens. Those 2 conditions are met. Horseshoe statement, antecedent by itself, and so for our very next line, if we needed to, if it would be beneficial, we can get out the consequent by itself. In this case, once again, it's B. So again, the ordering of the lines makes no difference, just as long as those 2 conditions are met. And further, the 2 lines need not come right next to one another, one right after the other. They can be separated by any number of lines. So that's modus ponens. If A then B, A therefore B, or text here, if P then Q, P therefore Q.